Welcome to part 2 of our grad project presentation. So this presentation is on tattoos and spirituality. It's really quite exciting. I noticed, however, that Archdeacon Mark Kingsbury, who's in the house, is here. I won't say you'll see him later in various forms, but I noticed that Mark actually did the evaluation before the presentation started. I think that's support, and the kind of support that Falen has. This is an extraordinary adventure because it's affected me as a professor. So when Falen first started proposing this, I don't know if you've ever noticed that people have tattoos now, right? So suddenly I found myself observing tattoos in a brand new way and actually asking questions. And I've told Falen this throughout the term. So I'd see a tattoo, and I used to kind of say, well, that's a really private thing, and what does that mean? But now I'm actually doing that, and I've had literally hundreds of fascinating conversations. I've never had somebody say to me, it's none of your business. They have all said, well, thank you. This is who did it, and this is why I had it done. We're about to take a journey with Falen, who noticed a similar phenomena and was intrigued by the spiritual dimension of that piece of body art. Falen McNulty, we're in your hands.
Make sure I take myself off mute so you can actually hear me this morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here this morning. I realize it's the first week of Lent, and all of us have a lot on our plates. To start, I want to share a story with you that, in part, brought me to this project. 14 years ago, my brother and I came home for the military for our summer vacation. My brother was well into the tattoo culture of the military by then, and he was sporting his most recent cross tattoo on his forearm. Now, there's something to note here. My brother is not a churchgoer, was not a churchgoer, and let's be honest, I don't foresee him being a churchgoer. But he is a Christian, and says so himself. So one evening we were sitting around the dining room table, and curiosity finally killed the cat with my mother, and she looked at him and went, why? Why, of all things to put on your body, did you put a cross? Now, you guys don't know my brother, but he has this really sly, smiling grin, and he looks over at my mother, kind of winks at me, and I thought, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. And he says, just because I don't go to church doesn't mean I don't believe in God. So for me, this has always raised the question, why do people get religious tattoos? Therefore, through an ethnographic research, I interviewed 3 people and 2 tattoo artists from across Canada to gain a better understanding as to why people would get a religious tattoo. The 3 participants varied in their ages from their early 20s to their late 30s, and the tattoo artist varied in experience from someone just starting out to a longtime artist. Questions that were asked to the participants were, of all the body art you could have gotten, can you tell me why you got a religious one? Has your tattoo, or how has your tattoo shaped you? Of the 2 artists, 2 of the questions that were asked to them were, how do you feel about doing religious tattoos? And is religious body art any different from non-religious body art? Tattoos can have a spiritual side. The church, over the years, has had an ambivalent position about it. Some hold true to the Leviticus 19 passage about not marking one's own body, while others turn to the New Testament and the sayings of Paul that he was a marked man for Christ as a reason to support tattoos. The histories of tattoos in society, especially in mainstream society, has changed over time. Tattooing is not something new. There has been cases of mummies found with tattoos that date back 5,000 years. During the Second World War, tattoos became something that most sailors had, usually some form of a pinup girl on their forearm. In some cases, Tattoos were used to mark and dehumanize people, like Jews during the Holocaust, or as a way to mark criminals. The trend of tattoos was embraced by merchant marines, bikers, and goths, though they did not become popular in culture until more recently. There have been some famous people, and even monarchs, that have had tattoos, including King George V and Edward VII. At some points in history, tattoos were a source of pride, mainly with Roman soldiers. During the time of the Crusades, Christian soldiers would actually be marked with the Jerusalem cross to ensure that if they were killed in battle, they would receive a Christian burial. As recently as the 1960s, tattoos were considered antisocial and were something often criminals had. By the 1970s, there had been a noticeable resurgence in tattoos. They were popularized by influential rock stars like the Rolling Stones. By the 1980s, they had become more culturally accepted. And now, tattoos are regularly seen on public figures, athletes, models, and even movie stars. Though it was said, even if you were an upstanding citizen, you certainly would not have had a tattoo. Today, we can say that tattooing has become mainstream. For example, TV shows like Miami Ink on the TLC network profiled tattoo artists Army James and Chris Nunez and their shop, as well as profiling people coming in to get their tattoos. Tattoo shops went from small places where the unruly went into super hip boutiques. An example of this is Ghost Town Tattoo and Barber in Okotoks, Alberta, where you can get a tattoo, a haircut, and a beard trim all in one place. People became so interested in shows like Miami Ink that it actually had 4 shows spin off from it. Some of you may recognize the name Kat Von D. She started out in Miami Ink, moved to Los Angeles, and opened her own shop, which was featured on LA Ink. People from all walks of life were attracted to the show Miami Ink and its spin-offs, inspiring them to get tattoos. Everyone from someone walking down the street to celebrities like Brentley Gilbert, the country singer, Chris Jacobs, the host of TLC's Overhaulin', and Craig Ferguson, the comedian and actor, appeared on Miami Ink. Tattoos have continued to grow even after these shows have finished. It is now said that the population base in which tattoos are growing are middle-class females. While Western society seems to have embraced a tattoo or body art culture, we in the world of church need to return to our roots in order to critically engage this phenomena. So let me turn to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 28, which says, "You shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead, or tattoo any marks upon your body. I am the Lord." Taking out of context, this seems clearly to say one should not get a tattoo. But if we look at this verses before it, there are many instructions to what we are not to do. In looking at a commentary about this passage and the time it was written, you would have to take into context the day and reasons why this passage would have been written. Pastor Chuck Gerwig, a pastor to students and families at Santa Cruz Bible Church in Santa Cruz, California, wrote the following. In this passage, God is speaking to his covenant people, Israel. He is specifically telling them to stay far from religious practices of the surrounding people groups. The prohibited religious practices in these verses, including eating bloody meat, fortune-telling, certain types of haircuts relating to priests and of false cults, cutting or marking the body for the dead, and consulting psychics. All of these practices would lead God's beloved people away from him and towards false gods. that were not God's at all. In the midst of this context, we find the words translated tattoo marks. It is important to note here that the context of this passage is not one of body decor, but one of marking oneself in connection with cultic religious worship. Bible commentaries tell us much about Eastern religious practices that God was warning his people to shun. This pastor is putting into context what was going on for the Israelites of the time. It seems that the Lord in this verse is actually telling people to stay away from creating false idols or gods. Now to look at some New Testament references. And what does Paul mean by saying he bears the marks of Christ on his body? Matthew Henry says the following of this section of Galatians: the apostle had in his body the marks of the Lord Jesus, the scars of wounds from persecuting enemies, for his cleaving to Christ and his doctrine to the gospel. The argument could be made that we are made in God's image, as was Christ, and because Christ was permanently marked for God, we should be allowed to mark ourselves as well. Though the argument is ongoing in the theological world because some feel tattoos take away from the beauty of the body which God created it, comparing a tattoo to that of graffiti on a work of art. While others feel it marks who they belong to and sees them as a way to communicate to others that they are Christians, similar to the Christian Crusaders mentioned earlier. With this tension in mind, I started my interviews. I had the honor of working with people from Newfoundland to British Columbia. And working with the data, a number of themes came into view. For this purpose of this presentation, I will focus on 3: pain, memory connection, and healing. The idea of pain in relation to a needle's puncturing the skin is reasonable and kind of obvious. The fact is that pain was touched on by everyone I spoke to. The actual physical sensation of extreme discomfort reveals a more existential dimension of pain, one that resonates with the theology of pain. As Christians, the role of pain and suffering as a dimension of a salvific act is not lost on us. So how does the experience of pain bring about transformation? One participant said, "When I get stressed out, I want to get a tattoo because the healing process, like that pain for a few days, it's refreshing sometimes." Another said, "The pain, it felt good." It's hard to explain it. It's not supposed to feel good, but I didn't mind it. And finally, the pain was a release. It was a step forward. The pain was a release for this person because it was a way of letting go of hurt. They were feeling a lot of pain and grief about the loss of a friend in a car accident. From speaking with this person, it was clear the accident had great effect on her life, and because her friend died, and because she and her parents survived. There was a lot of pain and suffering, though she was not forthcoming with any other details about the accident or her grief. One artist I spoke with described his use of tattoos and his practice in this way. I do a lot of spiritual processes with my clients before the tattoo to help them to connect to the divine, and sometimes they have a benevolent experience in the process. I follow the ways of the ancients, indigenous tribes, shamans, who invoke and evoke through the tattoo process. This was tattooing's origins in sacred ways. I apply modern-day science to a process I created from transpersonal psychology, counseling, NLP, and hypnosis. This enables the person to connect to the source and will at any time in the future. This is the focus of my work today, to bring back tattoos' sacred origins. The pain for some is a way to access their deeper emotional injury. In the review of the literature, I found many statements around the pain of our spiritual journey and the pain of a tattoo. In the article, Tattoos and Spirituality by Laura Hamilton, she says the following about getting a tattoo. Not only does it take conviction, it can also take a great deal of time, effort, and yes, pain. Sitting in the tattoo parlor, experiencing the sting of a needle can be a metaphor for the difficulties of life that we must endure. Laura Hamilton put into words what it seems others did not want to. The direct reference to the pain of tattoos and the connecting to the pain we endure in life. The other thing that came up in the articles that related to tattoos and spirituality is the link to pain and suffering. Getting a tattoo is a journey. This was reinforced by Jacob B. Mars in Holy Ink, The Spirituality of Tattoos. In this article, he talks about his wife's journey to her first tattoo and how the body became a canvas that we use to express our beliefs, pain, suffering, and our joys. The part that stood out in this article is where he compared tattoos to footprints, unaffected by tides, because they are fixed in living memory and can serve as monuments that allow one to retrace both a spiritual and an existential pilgrimage. For one of my participants, all three themes tied to one tattoo. She said that even though that one was not overtly Christian, it was the one that had had the most effect on her. 3 years after the car accident, she got the tattoo of a butterfly because it was her friend's favorite thing. And it also covered up her own scar from the car accident. She said, I felt a sense of closure from the accident. Mom, Dad, and I were in it, and she didn't make it. I was 16 years old when I got the tattoo, but the car accident happened when I was 13. So it was a big sense of closure, and the pain felt good. It's hard to explain it. It's not supposed to feel good, but it did. And I didn't mind it, right on my hip bone, which is really supposed to be one of the most painful areas. For one participant, the memory of one tattoo was the start of a story and a journey. He said, really, a lot of my tattoos are random, or just like this one tattoo I got because I was sitting in traffic and there was a tattoo shop there and I didn't want to sit in traffic, so. But that's a memory. I remember all the time, this random time, I got this tattoo, and now that tattoo artist is doing the piece on my back. So it's the beginning of a story, right? What started out as getting a tattoo because he was essentially stuck turned into a relationship of trust to do a bigger piece of work. As we were speaking about how that random tattoo came about and how it ties into some of the other work he has had done, it was clear of his memory and connection. The final theme that I would like to touch on is healing. That tattoos were part of what helped them deal with different situations in their life. With the themes of journey and healing coming up in the articles, the conversation around the idea with the participants was interesting to note. One of them saying, "I can see that, like the meaning of a tattoo, I can see that, a journey through pain, suffering, and healing as being helpful. I lost a bunch of weight, and I said if I kept it off for a year, I would tattoo my whole side. So when I was 25, I tattooed my whole side. So that one, I guess they do have some meaning." The idea that there's a relationship between healing and pain being connected to a deeper sense of suffering, one connected directly to loss and grief. The themes of loss and healing and connection to tattoos has come up a lot over the last year. Like Jody, I have been noticing people's tattoos, and I have been speaking to many different people about their tattoos to get a general idea of why. One thing that became clear to me was that some of the apparently non-religious tattoos that people have possess a greater spiritual significance and connection than some of the overtly religious ones do. With this project in mind over the last year, I've been speaking to as many people as I could about their tattoos, what they have, and the meaning behind them. I wanted to get a sense of tattoos in general society. I have heard so many stories of people's journeys and their lives and what their tattoos represent to them. One, a few weeks ago, while I was at the Dartmouth market, was explaining her sleeve tattoo to me. It was all fruits and vegetables. But to her, it was her past, her present, and her future. She was more than happy to share her story, her struggles, and in a way, her faith that was represented there. This was the interesting part of this research. It took on a life of its own. When talking to people about tattoos in general, the overall view of them in society, and how different generations view them. This past summer, while I was serving in a parish in New Brunswick, I sat down with a 90-plus-year-old lady, and we were talking about this project. And I still remember her, in her sweetest way, looking up at me and saying, "Well, an upstanding young lady like yourself would never have a tattoo." What a door that opened. Much to her surprise, I have tattoos. And this gave us an opportunity to have a conversation about my tattoos, as well as some of my friends. By the end of the conversation, she openly said that her opinion towards tattoos had changed, and that she wanted to know people's stories about them. For me, this is part where the connection and memory of them becomes an opening to communication among people and helps us engage with different generations. This research has been the start of many conversations and even sometimes debate. Debate about the biblical implications and conversations about how tattoos tell a story. As a member of the younger generation in the church, I have seen the struggles going on to build connections between our generations. Speaking with this 90-plus-year-old lady and other members of the church about this project, I believe was an eye-opening experience for all of us. It opened a door to a conversation, to a greater understanding of each other's position on the topic, without anyone getting defensive. This is where I can see this being useful for the church, and the church using this research. It can help to open conversations between generations. How in my 30s I view tattoo culture and how a World War II war bride views a tattoo are going to be very different. But in using this project as a starting point for conversation, we can engage each other and our views to build bonds that can last a lifetime. The study would be remiss if I didn't mention that there were some regrets raised about having certain tattoos in these interviews. These regrets arose in relation to a question I posed them: has your perception of your tattoo changed over time? All talked about the fact that it was a way of carrying things with them, but to express that they wish they had waited until they were older to get their first ones because of the regret and the need to cover them up. But even regret is part of the journey. It points to a maturation, one that is marked by a mark in the flesh. This is one theme that in future I would like to explore more, as I feel the connection to their journey and wanting to cover them up may have a deeper meaning, but that was not explored in the context of this research. The other piece I wanted to note was a follow-up to the research. One participant said the following: "You sparked a large introspective revelation re-tattoos my life and how they represent where I am at in that part in life." Example, my first regretful tattoos were meaningless bullshit that I did just for the sake of doing it, which was very me from the ages of 12 to 18 until I found myself. And then I put more thought into them, and they became more reflective of me as a person. Mind blowing. Sometimes we do not reflect on why we do things until somebody asks. So that is a takeaway for me, to ask the question. The answer might surprise you. The connection between tattoos and people's personal spirituality certainly came through in this research, along with the three themes of pain, memory connection, and healing. Though this started out to look at religious tattoos, the connection people feel to their other tattoos can have a greater connection or meaning than the religious ones. They are a personal story told through the art on their body. Thank you.
Falen, thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts, or shared tattoo experiences?
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the pain tattoo connection. And I'm curious in wondering whether some of the people that you interviewed had a mental health need and were exploring other areas through pain and using pain as a way of managing some symptomology.
Excellent question, Gary. Thank you. To be honest, that's not something I looked into with the research, was the mental health side of it. One of the participants did point out her semicolon tattoo, which is a denote for mental health issues and struggles, but it's not something the research actually looked into. The connection to pain, I'm not sure how many people in here have tattoos, but let's be honest, this is not the most comfortable of experiences you will ever endure in your life. And for anybody who's been on a spiritual journey, it's not one of the most pleasant experiences you'll endure in your life. But for me, as I was doing the research and having these conversations, actually one of the conversations I had while I was out in Alberta about it, talked about how that pain was such a release for them that when they have a bunch of stress and anger or frustration, the pain is a release. So they get a tattoo. Because the pain doesn't last 5 minutes, it doesn't last even 24 hours. You're usually looking at a few days for the healing process to actually happen. So for them, they've seen that significance. Now, the people I interviewed, I probably should note, are self-proclaimed Christians, but non-attenders. So sometimes that connection was a little harder to draw out, but as we delved into the reasons behind their tattoos, the reasons of the memorial and the significance of what they represented in their lives was very clear.
Thanks, Falen. So the way you described your participants just talking about the significance of pain in their tattoo experience, about the release and such, it did remind me a lot about how some people who cut or self-harm talk about pain and the importance of, and how that is a release for them. And so I wondered, did you make that connection at all with any of your participants, or did you have any conversation about if they self-harm, or if this is like a form of self-harm for them? And I'm curious, if you did go there, did you have conversation about or make any connections around maybe a spiritual longing that is at the root of some of that pain?
Thank you, April. Excellent question. To be honest, I did not get into self-mutilation or self-cutting. It's something that I'm aware of in the pain dimension, but it's not something that was covered in any of the research. One of the participants, actually, who uses pain as a bit of or the tattoos as a bit of a release, talks about the fact that his tattoos all do have a meaning for him, though it's a pain reaction. He'll get stuff he's been working towards when he needs that release, but it's not his only release. We did talk about that briefly. He talked about his other stuff that he's involved with, that he has another way to release and coping mechanisms, but he also said that as a younger person, he probably did some of the tattoos because he didn't have coping mechanisms. But also he talked about his returning to faith. So he grew up in the church, grew up as a child attending Sunday school, like most of us probably did, but balked the church in his mid-teens to early 20s, and since having his own children, has started to make a migration back to church and actually has been back a few times since Christmas. So there is a dimension to that, not one that I've explored enough to completely say one way or the other. He's getting his step count in while he's here.
Thanks, Falen, for your presentation. My brother has a lot of tattoos, and he also is involved in suspension. And his fiance told me once that she uses suspension as a way to explore painful memories. And this was making me think of, your presentation was making me think whether this is kind of a replacement for ritual for people that don't participate in rituals in a kind of secular society. And I'm wondering whether in the Christian tradition you see any ways that we can explore pain and the rituals that we have.
Excellent question, Jenny. Thank you. I'm just playing that back in my head so I can try to answer you here. Do I see it as a replacement? Interestingly enough, that came up with our resident theologian that visited our class. Is it representing something that's not there? Thanks, David. So I've actually had a chance to ponder that slightly. For some of them, I would say yes. It depends on the tattoo. and what they're doing. I can personally say my tattoos, no. I don't have them as a memorial or a memory to something like that. That being said, some people that are very near and dear to me have some very significant tattoos on their body as a memorial and a memory to people they have lost. My own brother will share his story, if you ever meet him, about the 2 infinity symbols he wears. Because he is forever connected to my uncle, who is no longer with us. One is him, one is my uncle, infinitely together, infinitely with me. Great profound thing for him. Do I think there's a way that the church can use the dimension of pain and spirituality expressed in some of these tattoos in conversation? Definitely. Do I know how that would look or what that would look like at this point? No, I don't.
So I have a question as well.
Oh.
Thanks for the presentation. I also have a brother who's tattooey and into suspension, but that's not what the question is about. As a professor of Hebrew, there's a couple of ways that I have experienced tattoos. One, sometimes people will show me tattoos on their body in Hebrew and ask me to read it, and luckily I've mostly been able to make them out. But I've also get a pretty steady stream of requests, or at least I used to in Toronto, from students who wanted me to write something in Hebrew, and I would say why, and the reason was usually because they wanted to put it on their body. And I've never knowingly written stuff in Hebrew so people can get tattoos, because tattoos have a certain kind of association in Judaism that I think I don't really want to be party to causing offense in that way. And on your first slide, you had a picture of the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, and there's a whole theology of writing and not writing the divine name. And that's often the most tattooed thing in Hebrew if people are going to put that on their body. And I find that actually really problematic. We do live in an age where there's a lot of offense giving and offense taking, but that's an area where I actually think caution is due. Can you say anything about the kind of theology of tattoos that actually kind of resists? I'm not exactly quite sure what the question is, but I do think that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed in a different way as people think about attitudes about tattoos. Although, we live in an age where the tattoo ink flows freely. Specifically, Hebrew tattoos. Any reflections or thoughts about the issue of appropriating a tradition which has a different attitude to Leviticus than most of the world, frankly, than most of the church?
Thank you for your question, Daniel. Excellent question. I think we have to be careful with it, because I think it falls into the whole cultural appropriation thing. I feel like I need to point this out about the Yahweh tattoo. So the 3 tattoos you see on the arm, the Yahweh, the Logos, and the Arabic statement of faith, are actually all on the same person, on the same arm. So they literally rotate his arm. Which is interesting in itself, of a Christian sporting these 3 things. Which I had tension with myself, and wish I had had more time to explore with him when I had met him, but I didn't, unfortunately. I personally don't think I would ever put something Hebrew on my body, just for the basic factor that that is the Jewish tradition, and I know they believe in the Leviticus and don't necessarily see the sayings of Paul. So I personally would see it as a cultural appropriation and wouldn't do it. I see how that tension would come about, and not something I necessarily gave a whole lot of thought to in addressing in this research, though.
Grad Project Aerobics.
This is a really fascinating topic. Just in terms of people describing pain that feels good, Teresa of Avila she wasn't getting tattoos, but she did talk about delectable pain. So, and even within the mystical Christian tradition, there's a lot about pain and ecstasy. So that might be an interesting place for you to look for theological kind of grounding. It strikes me, there's a couple of themes that I hear. religions are often about how do we suffer. And in some ways, these people are showing us one way. That is really interesting to me, too. And I've often stood in grocery store lineups. I don't do the self-check thing because you can often observe very interesting things about people's groceries, but also their bodies and reading their tattoos. But so with this practice, we can read bodies. So for instance, one time I saw this guy and I could read cash, and so I thought, oh, that's really interesting. The S was a dollar sign. So I asked him about it, and he said he was working somewhere where they called it Cashville. I think it was in Alberta, and they were making shitloads of money. And so this is what a group of them put on their bodies. So there's that theme of reading bodies that's really interesting. But also these days, tattoos have become identifiers. So if you're looking for a criminal, they put a photograph of this person's tattoo. And I don't know how this all relates, but I wonder if you could comment on some of those things, especially like if you had thoughts about how to suffer and this as a practice of suffering. And number two, reading bodies, what that might mean theologically.
Thank you very much, Alda. Excellent question. So the suffering component of it, I think, is something I'm still working through myself. Recently doing a journey to a new tattoo myself. And the period of pain and the dimension that goes with it ties into a lot of the journeys and stories that I experienced through this project. The interesting thing with the marking of people, when I was reading about the Christian Crusaders, so that they'd make sure they got a Christian burial, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Okay, I wonder what their leaders thought of that. Being from a military background and seeing the culture of tattoos in the military and all the guys on basic and their first Liberty weekend going off to the tattoo parlor and they all get the tri-service badge tattooed on their shoulder, and you go, really, guys? And sometimes there's not a lot of thought put into tattoos, and I will be the first one to admit that. But the dimension of suffering with it and how there is something to explore there further, definitely. Because suffering is something, whether any of us want to admit to it or not, happens on a daily basis in our society, in our world. And some people put their story on their body to read. And that was something I never realized, similar to what Jody said earlier, how open people are to talk about their tattoos until I started asking the question. And I think the lady at the market was probably the most surprising one. I wasn't alone in that experience. Somebody else was with me. And afterwards, the two of us went, wow. Like, because of her story and how much she was willing to divulge right there in the middle of the market because I asked her about her tattoo. So for me, we are reading each other's bodies. Some of us, you can't readily see we have tattoos. Most people, when they first met me for many years, I mean, my first tattoo is 14 years old. You wouldn't know I had it. My second one's a little more obvious and a little more blatant. You can see it on a regular basis. But that was intentional on my part. So sometimes, yes, people are marking their bodies and putting a story on their body, but they're not putting the story there for everybody to see. So sometimes it's a hidden story, kind of like we hide our suffering. So I think there's a whole lot more exploration that could be done in that area. And I hear somebody in the back of my brain going, doctoral thesis, and I'm resisting against that at the moment. But yes, I know, I definitely agree there's a lot more research can be done within that dimension that hasn't been done yet.
I'm really curious about the artist who spoke about bringing back the spirituality of the tattooing process, and about them a little bit. Like, what about them, what about their own faith tradition makes them lean towards having spiritual practices before tattooing and bringing forward this idea of a benevolent process on part of the person receiving the tattoo?
Excellent question, Kim. Thank you. I can give you a little bit of background on him. He's not somebody I know really well. He's a tattoo artist of somebody I know. From what I understand of him and reading his biography, he lived life on the edge for many years, was very deep in the tattoo culture and some of the stereotypes that go with it, with drugs, alcohol, the whole 9 yards, and had, as was described to me, his coming to Jesus moment, and walked away from the drugs and the alcohol and started his own journey to recovery, and through that found a way to use tattoos as part of that journey to tell part of his story. And he's working with other people to help them walk through that journey as well, to healing and recovery, whatever that may be for them. Remind me, I can send you his website.
So you spoke about soldiers going off and getting tattooed, and I'm interested in tattoos against your will. Specifically, what comes to mind are Holocaust survivors and having tattoos on their arms, and how they live with that, and options for having tattoos removed. And I think it would be really fascinating to explore that end of, why survivors of violence who have been primarily if their bodies have been marked against their will, how they deal with that.
Thank you for your question, Roxanne. Excellent question, and I'll be honest, that is not something I went into in this research at all, other than to say that it is noted that in history that tattoos were used to dehumanize people, like the Jews during the Holocaust. I did not go any further into that research at this time.
The whole pain and healing aspect that you go into really resonated with me. You might not be able to tell this, but I'm going to talk from the British perspective, and that is that we do not properly deal with trauma, personal experience. You suffer the loss of a loved one, and after a period of time, a very short period of time, you're expected to get on with life, and you don't process that pain, and it stays with us. We carry it with us. And until we go into that pain, we can't heal from it. So my question is, in these people, if they had been able to process the deep pain that they had in a different way, do you think they would still have had tattoos?
Thank you for your question. Yes. Especially the ones that I know that have done it as a memorial. The ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head very quickly, yeah, they'd still have tattoos, definitely. More, and it maybe not be for the pain dimension, but for the ability to carry that forward and tell their story. I've used my brother as an example, and I'm really glad he agreed to let me do that. His tattoo that he got after my uncle died. My brother was very close to him and spent a lot of time with him in his final months. My brother took that loss very hard. And part of his dealing with it was, one, getting a tattoo my uncle always wanted to get and never did, but also the ability to say, this is why I did this. I can share his story because somebody's going to ask me why I have that tattoo. So instead of him hiding his pain and never dealing with it, he's actually forced to deal with it quite regularly because someone will say to him, hey, why do you got 2 infinity symbols on your wrists? And it brings it back, that he has to work through it on a regular basis. So I think sometimes we may not necessarily realize what we're doing when we do it, but we put it there so that we can share that story and also share the story of the life we're remembering. So the man my uncle was, my brother gets to share that story when somebody asks him about that tattoo. So his memory, his life, his joy carries on in my brother that way. Whereas if my brother didn't have that tattoo, how could he share the story? Who could he share the story with? Who would ask 10 years down the road? So yes, I truly believe that they would still have some form of tattoo even if they had a different outlet of dealing with the pain.
Kind of following on the previous question, I think the idea of hurting the body for the sake of the soul is both old and deep in Christian and other traditions. As is the notion of finding ways to memorialize, to remember, to make known. So you write books, you make movies, you go on pilgrimages, you have family gatherings, you do there's all kinds of things. But I wonder if you have any insights into why now the idea of doing this by permanently marking one's own body is more among us than it has been before. Why this? Why not write a book? Why not send a letter to the editor? Why not start a blog? Why not send a thank you card or a greeting note or put something embroidered on your wall?
Thank you, Deborah. In some ways, as we're reflecting on this, I'm kind of comparing a tattoo to a really big headstone. We erect these monuments, and if you watch now in society, less and less people are having these monuments erected. But the other thing I think that has changed drastically is the cultural acceptance of tattoos. Whereas if in the 60s and 70s, the only way you had a tattoo is you were in the Navy, and therefore you were classified as a sailor or a criminal. It wasn't very popular among the general population. So I think the shift of cultural acceptance has made it more common. And I think the idea that people are looking at different, as far as writing books and stuff go, we're such a technological age that everything's so instant that we don't sit down and write like we used to. What generations before us used to sit down and write and memorialize, we don't do. So I think that also plays into the cultural differences that have caused some of this shift.
Sure. One more, and then that'll probably be it.
Yes, thank you. And I think we have to be cautious of circularity and saying that the cultural acceptance is higher now, because I think my question really is, why is the cultural acceptance higher now? I'm wondering if something is changing about the way we are looking at the body. And that would have, moved the cultural change, which then creates this spiral. And now I'm told one of the biggest growth industries in the US is tattoo removal. So perhaps we're heading away, but I think that something is changing about the way we look at the body. And that was what I was trying to get at. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think in some ways we've become more autonomous, that my body is my body and I will do what I want with my body, which is probably not something that was there as much before. I'm playing with that a little bit in my head as I'm working through it. It's an excellent question, and one that I'm probably going to have to reflect on a bit more to give you a solid answer on.
This might follow a little bit on what Debbie said. I just it kind of can sense people grappling and thinking about pain and dealing with pain in an external sense. And I just thought that I wanted to point out that we're all managing our pain in various ways. And I think maybe in previous generations we did manage it through writing or through ways that were more mental. But cutting, say, is not necessarily a more disturbed way of dealing with pain than fabricating a personality or, having other various issues that might be looked at as addictions, or thinking of ourselves as a good person and managing our pain through doing good works for other people. Like, I think that we tend to still be a bit traumatized by the idea that people would hurt themselves to manage their pain, but I just think it needs to be pointed out that we're all managing our pain all the time.
Thank you, Shannon.
Do you want to comment?
Did I want to comment? I agree, Shannon. we all deal with pain very differently. Pain is such a dimension of our lives that, being from a bit of a military background, the suck it up and move on and not dealing with it. That being said, I think we're in a pendulum shift of we may have hit how far of that pendulum we're going to go to, and we're going to start to swing back the other way. Because I feel like we've gone from hiding all of our pain to we bear every little minute detail of our lives, and I think we need to find an equilibrium balance in that.
Okay, it's about 11:30, or shortly before 11:30, so we should tidy this up. Wow. Let's, 3 things.
Oh boy.
Okay, the first one is there is lunch after this presentation, so it's in the President's Lodge. So if you'd like to go for lunch, and again, it's a beautiful day, so please help yourself to lunch, and we're happy. We'd love to have you come and continue the conversations that have been stimulated already this morning. So just afterward, you can leave here and go over. And again, I'd asked about the evaluation, so please do an evaluation. That's really, really important. That's first and really second thing. Oh, no, second thing is we're gathering again at 12:50, 10 minutes to 1, 10 minutes to 1. And Bill McIntyre is going to take us on a journey with people who live with addictions. And his research, if you think you knew about people with addictions before and their God ideation, get ready to have that, I hope, blown out of the water. Please, it's an extraordinary time this afternoon. So Bill's going to be with us just after lunch, and then Daniel McDonald will be looking at a cup of tea and the rituals contained in that. All of those people are going to take you on extraordinary journeys this afternoon. So as Bill likes to say, he make sure you fasten your seatbelts. I hope that you had your seatbelts on this morning. I should have warned you earlier, because I think it was worthy of, there was some turbulence. So I just want to pick up on a point and then say thank you to Falen for her work. D.W. Winnicott, a psychiatrist, an English psychiatrist, he's probably well known to a lot of people, talks about a thing called transitional objects. And we all have them. When we go from one place to another, we will take a transitional object with us, whether we like it or not. It's just a keepsake, something small, and it does something for us. It reminds us who we are. We have to take it with us. Now, the really interesting thing about Falen's presentation is she identified 2 groups of people, and actually, tangentially, paradoxically, a third group of people in Jews, or people who are tattooed against their wills, but 2 groups of people who actually are tattooed against their wills or have a will dimension to it. That's military personnel and prisoners, all of whom are stripped naked, and everything's taken from them. But many choose tattoos as a transitional object. It contains both pain, because it's a memory. And if you think about a lot of the military, I worked in Camp Hill for a time as a chaplain, and some of those little guys had mother written on there, or home, or their town, Bridgewater, or Halifax, or Dartmouth, written on their arm, as a memory of where they are, where they're from. It's a critical piece of insight. And it became a launching pad to all kinds of stories. And in prison, people put marks on themselves, partly to say, I'm tough maybe, but also to remind them who they are. So you were able to catch an edge, I think, of a fascinating piece. And if you think about the last 15, 20 minutes of the conversations and questions posed, it opened a plethora of possibilities for further exploration and further study. What is this relationship? Somehow deep inside us is access to pain and transition and transitional spaces that have and hold meaning, power, and extraordinary spirit. And you took us on that journey this morning. Well done. Thanks so much. Okay.